Hi, welcome to Conversations with a Wounded Healer. I'm your host, Sarah Bueno, and today's guest is Michael Lassoff. He is a practicing psychotherapist in Houston, Texas, and he manages the young adult intensive outpatient program for Pathos at the Lovett Center. He's also training to become a Diamond Approach teacher, which is a spiritual group that incorporates meditative practices as well as psychoanalytic theory. So I got to tell you a funny story about Michael. Well, I guess it's not a very particular story, but I met Michael it was in January in Houston the first time we met, and it was snowing in Houston. And people who are from Chicago are like, okay, yeah, whatever, it's snowing. I mean, snowing in Houston is a big deal for them. And literally the entire town shut down. Like, I was supposed to be in Houston to, meet everybody at the Lovett Center and go all about town, and literally could not do any of that because the entire town shut down. So that was the first time I met Michael. The second time I met Michael, we toe up some karaoke in Houston. We were doing a leadership retreat for the team at Pathos. And in Houston, it was Gay Pride that weekend. And I don't remember which one of us had the brilliant idea to do karaoke, but we did. And I got to tell you, this man can do some karaoke like few others. So I hope you enjoy this interview with Michael Lassoff. Well, how did you become a therapist? So from being a Sikh as a child and then having your parents kind of split off in different directions, religiously, spiritually, philosophically, how did you end up where you are now?
Well, I was raised in a Sikh community. My name on my birth certificate was Guru Kirtan Singh Khalsa, and then my parents left that when I was around 8, and then they divorced, and my dad went on to be a non-practicing Jew, and my mom kind of went to be a pretty devoted Baptist. And I think between being raised Sikh and then both of them going their separate ways, I think I just have a lot of question marks in terms of explanations for what's going on. And the main thing I'll say about the Sikhs is it was communal living. And I think I've always been drawn towards groups that are into growth and development. Like in middle school, I got really involved with 12-step communities, even though I'd never really done any drugs or drinking, really.
Really?
Drank.
That's
Yeah, and
awesome.
I went through the 12 steps a couple times. And I think I just liked going there because, middle school sucks and people were a bit nicer there.
Mm.
And, it was just nice to be somewhere where when you said bye, people hugged you and said, I love you. I think the other side of that was growing up as a Sikh and wearing a turban and stuff. I think it was always a question for me whether I felt like I belonged or was kind of excluded or on the margins. And even at the 12-step thing, there was an interesting piece about feeling like whether I belonged because I'd never really done any stuff. But, and then I think through most of high school, I was kind of really involved with social climbing and that kind of thing. And I became captain of lacrosse team at my high school and started listening to Dave Matthews Band and wearing blue jeans and one of those white hats that said what college I was going to go to. And I dipped tobacco. I liked that. I got into baseball.
That sounds, the tobacco part sounds very Texas.
It was. I was trying to fit in, I think. I don't know. I was miserable. I was always kind of like depressed for most of high school. I spent most of high school pretty depressed, usually in the wake of like some terrible romantic deterioration of some sort.
I just love how dramatic that phrase is, romantic deterioration. I love it.
Honestly, that probably makes it sound like it came together more than it did. I spent most of high school really in love with these gals that I barely knew. I just had a very strong fantasy life and imagined somebody loving me. And I was very lonely. A lot of crying in my room by myself listening to Joni Mitchell.
Aw, me too. Not Joni Mitchell, but yes.
Yeah, no, Elliott Smith, all the classics. And then I got really into Buddhism. And I was planning on ordaining as a Buddhist monk for most of college. And
I could totally see that.
Yeah, it was kind of the first thing I ever heard that made sense to me. And I think it was a really big deal to just have a narrative for the first time that made sense of what I was feeling and didn't just sound like nonsense. I'd never heard anything. I wasn't really raised particularly theistically, and I think there were so many like competing truth claims that it was more confusing than anything, and I was just in a lot of pain. So
Right.
I think it meant a lot to me to be able to finally make a little meaning of that. And in some sense, it was kind of the first time I felt a holding environment that comes from just understanding, where like all of a sudden it seems like not just chaotic, but a kind of perspective that organizes things.
Yeah.
But that was complicated, wanting to be a monk. I think a lot of that was my way of trying to say fuck you to my dad. And another big part of that was probably how depressed I was about my sense that women didn't like me. I just thought that like love was a shit show, and kind of human relatedness was just a dead end that terminates in kind of this empty, meaningless hell realm.
Again, like just the way you talk, it's just amazing. Go on. I fucking love you.
It probably sounds hyperbolic, but I mean, I was crying in my room a lot, and none of it made any sense.
I get it. It did feel that way for me too, actually well into my 20s. So, yes.
I totally wanted to die. I mean, it just this thing seemed bullshit.
Yeah, yeah.
So, then I started seeing a therapist. And, for me, I'd always wanted to see a therapist, I think. I don't know where I got that karma from, but it just seemed like I'd always wanted to go because I thought that would help me make sense of all the crazy stuff I was thinking. I mean, for me, it felt like almost like this really exciting Sherlock Holmes kind of like, ooh, that's why I do that. So my therapist was also a practicing Buddhist, and it was really with him that I got to sort of see how much of my longing to be a monk was sort of a reaction formation to a lot of stuff that I think I was trying to skip dealing with. I think, what's the guy, the British poet, is it William Blake? Yeah, he's got that poem about the chimney sweep, and, one of the things that I always stuck out with me is like the kid's hair's dirty, so they just cut it off, And I think that was kind of what I was, rather than trying to work through something, I think I was just trying to cut off all my hair.
Yeah, literally and figuratively.
So, and anyways, then I got really involved with this group called the Diamond Approach, which has been my, spiritual path for the past 15 years. I'm doing the teacher training program for that. And that one really integrates sort of the spiritual preoccupations I was dealing with a really pretty sophisticated psychological mindedness. It's grounded in object relations theory. That was where I first started reading like Winnicott and Kohut and Kernberg and Fairbairn and Margaret Mahler and Melanie Klein. And I guess that's probably around, a bit into that was when I started thinking maybe I could make a living as a psychotherapist because I was just reading that stuff for fun. And I guess I could also say that motivation-wise, when I was reading the information you sent me about exploring my feelings about healing, I would say that by and large, that's pretty low on the totem pole of what drew me to being a therapist. I actually don't feel that strong of a longing to help people.
Go on. I love that.
Lovett Center.
Yeah, right. Come to the Lovett Center where
helping professionals. Sorry, Robert.
We don't give a fuck if we help you. Oh man.
I can fix this.
How do we spin this?
I'm not opposed to helping people. Just let me clarify that. But the thing doesn't work unless it's helpful. I mean, I get that.
Right.
So I can say this. My first job as a social worker was actually planning funerals for homeless people.
Really?
Yeah. So I worked for Harris County Community Service Department's Office of Social Services Indigent Bereavement Program.
That's a mouthful.
Right. You had to get good at saying that.
Yeah.
So I worked there, and it was, actually Texas is in this one way quite liberal. Our program for, and just the Texas charter is that if somebody dies in Texas, the state pays for their funereal services and a funeral. So if you die in Texas and you got nothing, the state will pay for a 15-minute funeral and cremation or burial. It's a cremation first policy, but you don't even have to have a good reason. You know, you just sort of, I think he would have wanted to be buried, and that's kind of good enough.
I want to pause on that just for a second, just because I'm thinking, like, is that a nod to Christianity that, like, because I do find the differences between Chicago and Texas, there seems to be a lot more people who, or I guess a lot less people who struggle with the idea of a Christian God, just from what I've observed from the people you guys work with. Do you think that has anything to do with it?
I mean, the long and short is I don't know. Probably. As a matter of fact, so we brought in a pro bono minister who would do the services, and it was by and large a Christian service, which isn't so offensive considering that it seems like the Jews and the Muslims largely handled that separately. We just never got any calls. And there might have been some John Does. We did services. We got quite a few John and Jane Does that we would do a service for anyways. And that was a fun part of the job, is I would often officiate that one. Usually read some poetry or just kind of say some stuff. So, yeah, I mean, it was by and large a Christian service, but anybody who called, it was our policy that they could request otherwise, and it just never happened.
That's so interesting. I'm going to have to look up and see what we do in Illinois. I literally have no idea, and I've never thought about it before.
Yeah, no, and before I'd gone and planned these funerals, I had worked as an event coordinator. My job before I went back to school was planning weddings and mitzvahs. So I thought it was kind of funny that, like, my first job out of the gates would kind of be so much. It's actually infinitely easier to plan a funeral than a wedding.
Yeah, less people, I guess, given input.
Yeah. I mean, and especially on this level, there were no personalized napkins or anything like that.
Right. True. So back to not helping people. Go on.
Well, so anyway, my second job, oddly enough, was doing home visits with seniors. So I was working for Jewish Family Services, and if some of the people there, they provide a lot of case management services there, and if the case manager determined that somebody was really depressed and would benefit from talking to somebody, they'd send me out there, an intern, to just kind of go talk to them. And that was a really interesting experience, because my first job in any kind of clinical capacity really was going and meeting with seniors, most of whom had cognitive difficulties. And one of them was like a Holocaust survivor. And
wow.
I mean, here I was in my 20s, showing up, wanting to make a difference, and looking these people in the eyes and being like, "Hi, I'm your therapist." And the really tricky business of it is that they, by and large, got worse every week.
Yeah.
They were definitely in decline in every sense of the word. And so my first job was really showing up in a weekly fashion for people that every week got worse. So I really learned something very important there, which is that, well, hell, let me see if I can remember.
It's so important
this
that
is a great spiel.
Right.
It's
I love
one of my
it.
best.
Yeah.
I'm giving you my gold here. If I can remember it. Well, so yeah, it's really that in some sense there are things more important than somebody getting better.
Yeah.
And that showing up every week, and this is super true with, I think, suicidal patients or say somebody who's schizophrenic or, got a more chronic mental health condition. If the therapy is predicated on helping them in terms of them getting better, right, I think burnout is just inevitable. Or you just end up not helping people that got a losing hand in a certain kind of way. And I've personally found it to be a deeply gratifying work to show up in a loving and supportive way, even though somebody's not gonna get better.
But how is that not healing still? Because it sounds like you're thinking about the word healing meaning to get better. And I think what makes something better is connection, even though the condition might not, quote unquote, get better. I still think of it as healing.
Sure. Well, I mean, we're definitely out of the medical model at that point.
Well, fuck
Um,
that medical model.
yeah, which I don't really buy in too much anyways. I guess, yeah, I mean, at this point, we're probably in a fairly sophisticated idea of what healing is, and at this point, I guess I'd just sort of say that I think that the thing that draws me towards being a therapist more than anything is a love of the truth.
Hmm.
My favorite moments are just when I'm sitting with somebody and sort of like their authenticity just becomes more palpable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's like these moments where there's like a quickening of just there being more of their truth in the room,
Right.
and I think it turns out that that is helpful. So it's not to say that I disregard the helpfulness. Obviously, if I'm justifying to somebody who's thinking about coming to an IOP, I leave that out of my pitch.
Oh, good, good.
I just really think it's an honor to sit with people and be with their truth. And I see that as creating a sacred space in which more and more of people's truth can come into the room. And again, I think that turns out to be helpful. And I think that turns out to be healing. But those are like side effects.
Right. Well, I guess I've never really thought of it that way, but I guess that really is what I love about therapy too, is like helping people be more of themselves. And that's, yeah. And I remember my first job working with people in recovery at a detox, and I just was so inspired all the time, just seeing people doing their best to be the best version of themselves. And that's what I've realized I just want to surround myself with, is people who are intending to work toward being the best version of themselves as much as possible.
Yeah. As I was preparing for this, I started to think about, well, what my kind of the main stories I pull on to kind of make sense of healing. Have you heard about the story of Philoctetes?
I don't know. Tell
That
me.
one you're familiar with? Philoctetes he's a character in Greek mythology. The only surviving text with him in it is one of Sophocles' plays, although I believe Euripides and Aeschylus wrote one about him as well. The gist of it is, I think the pre-story is that when Heracles or Herodotus, some Greek guy, wanted to die by being burnt on a pyre alive, so dramatic. Philoctetes was the only one who would light the pyre for him. And then once the guy died that way, Heracles awarded Philoctetes this magic bow that had poison arrows that could, sort of shoot and kill anybody. So then it comes time for the Trojan War. Philoctetes was, the Trojan War started, according to the mythology, when like three different guys were all gonna court Helen, and there was like a contest, and then one of them won. Philoctetes is one of the guys that lost, and then when she was taken away, the other suitors had to go with, I think his name was Menelaus, to go, get her back, and then that's the Trojan War. It was probably just oil, but that's the story.
Right.
It's usually oil. Anyways, the story has it that Philoctetes, he got bit by a snake or something like that, I think, in the story. And then, he started screaming out and it festered. And I think the Greeks deserted him on this island because he was screaming out so much and his wounds smelled bad. I think that was the gist of it.
All right.
And so they deserted on there for 10 years. And then they went off to fight the Trojan War. They weren't winning. And then finally they were like, hey, some god, I think maybe Hera or something, was like, hey, you guys are cursed because you left Philoctetes and you got to go back and get him. Anyways, I'll cut it short. I mean, the gist of it is that they have to go back and get this wounded guy to help them win. That's way too long of a story. So the main point is it doesn't make any sense. He's deserted on this island for 10 years, and then they need him, so they come back to get him, and he's like, fuck you, I ain't gonna help. And they're basically trying to convince him that his suffering amounted to something and that he can turn it all around and come help him. And he's like, yeah, right, I just want to go home and I don't want to help you guys. So it's a kind of story of bitterness and suffering. And I guess the other story that I think about a whole lot So anyways, the whole point of that is just this image I have in my mind of a guy that's been deserted in pain, and then others are asking him for help, and he's like, screw off. I'm bitter and I'm still in pain. Finally, like, the gods intervene and he helps them, but that's like a really unsatisfactory resolution of that problem.
Yeah.
And then I guess the other one that really comes to my mind is Job, where, Job loses everything. And the really fascinating bit is that there's three people that come along, and in the Bible they're called comforters, which is sort of hilarious because basically one after the other, their basic shtick is, you must have done something wrong.
Mm-hmm. That's good empathy there.
Well, oddly enough, I actually think it is. And I think it's what most of us do, even if we're more subtle about it. But basically, I think it's easier when in a horrible situation to feel like it must have happened for some reason.
Oh, of course. Yeah, to make sense out of it.
Yeah, it's like the moral defense, which is basically, like kids who grow up in horribly abusive environments, it's actually way easier for them to feel like it's because they did something wrong. Because at least in that narrative, there's a reason for it to happen, and then B, there's like something they can do about it, which is try and be good.
Mm-hmm.
The alternative, though, is that it happened for no reason, and that their caregivers are chaotic and
sick,
unpredictable, and possibly tantalizing. And what's really interesting is when God finally does show up, and it's usually considered to be not that satisfying of a resolution, but I think it really cuts to the core of how I understand healing, is basically God shows up and Job starts kind of making his case, and God basically says, you exist.
You're welcome.
Yeah. And the resolution is that Job, there's another ending, which is where he gets everything back, but historians think that that's just a kind of add-on later because it's so unsatisfying, the actual resolution, which is that he's left, I think the translation is some form of like shock and awe, but that is actually, he's calmed by just being confronted with existence itself.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose that's kind of the best I can do with suffering, is I just really don't think that our job is to take it away.
Right.
And I also don't think that our job's always just to make meaning of it either. But I do think that if we can absorb it and be with it and really be fully awake to the truth of it, that there's a kind of awe and mystery that becomes possible. Just like that we're not really entitled to anything, that even with suffering, existence is sort of some sort of miraculous thing that even if it's adverse, we're just simply not entitled to.
That's so interesting, and it brings up a ton of fear for me. Like, as soon as you said it's not even our job to make meaning out of it, because that's all my shit. That's like, no, I have to make meaning because I have to feel safe. And that's why, even though I wholly subscribe to Buddhist philosophy, I struggle with the idea that there is no God, because I need somebody to be up there like making it okay. And it's such a, like, groundlessness is such a terrifying concept for me that I've been trying to open to, but it's hard.
Totally. I'll say my first actual real, like, kind of clinical job where I received any bit of training, really, to speak of. I didn't really feel like I got a whole lot of training in school, and I felt like I was kind of just thrown into these other really intense situations. I worked with at the Houston OCD program, and the treatment for that is exposure therapy, and I keep coming back to that. Really, I think exposure therapy, the less behavioral, kind of more less sciencey version of it, I suppose, is I think exactly what you're saying. I mean, you're speaking to a kind of chasm that opens up when we stop kind of compulsively making meaning out of things.
Right.
That I think actually it takes about 20 years of concerted focusing on it to kind of settle down. Like, I think we just habituate to it. I think we acclimate. And then by the time we're 70, sort of like we can just kind of hang out with the deep intimacy of nothingness.
Because otherwise, I suppose death would be very terrifying.
Yeah, I got all my chips in that table or eggs in that basket.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah,
if
and
if
it's
that
funny.
narrative breaks down, I'm screwed.
Well, and the way that I've thought about death, like both my parents died in 2014, and so I've been confronted with it in a really interesting way, and the way that I've conceptualized it, I've made a conceptualization about it, which makes me then feel safe, which makes me feel like, okay, if I die, I'll be fine. But it's only
Sure.
because I made meaning out of it.
Yeah, which is, I think, a great like transitional thing to do. I mean, it's
Mm-hmm.
well, let's put it this way: not making meaning, you still end up making meaning. It's just, I think, in a way, I'd say that no matter what, we kind of end up making a meaning of it. And really, I think what you're calling making meaning is sort of just having a way of processing it such that it can
Mm-hmm.
be metabolized and
Right.
digested and kind of absorbed. And I think there would be no version of it without that transitionally. And I think it's a way, like, it wouldn't be like appropriate with patients to sort of not make meaning of their travail.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're already doing that. It's just usually these automatic negative thoughts
Mm-hmm.
and kind of self-defeating beliefs that kind of create these really painful, vicious cycles in their lives, and characterized by avoidance and
Mm-hmm.
self-hatred, typically.
Mm-hmm.
So I think so much of what we do is supporting people and making a kind of meaning of these experiences that has like a greater degree of grace, for a lack of better word there.
Yeah. And to kind of pivot into, some of the wounded healer talk, I guess, when I think about creating space and being able to help people make meaning and or sit with some of the stuff that they're struggling with, I know I certainly tap into my own wounds and the struggles that I've had. So I guess I'm curious how you relate to that concept of, even if you're not going to call yourself a healer or even believe that you do healing, but
Definitely wounded.
yeah, that one's easier to swallow.
Yeah. No, well, I'll say this. I personally would never feel any degree of trust for a therapist unless I thought that he or she had been a completely miserable bastard or gal. I only trust somebody who seems like they kind of been to hell and back, and it kind of has that earned innocence of sort of recovering from suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, I just sort of don't feel like the person has a capacity to understand things. At this point, I just like actually don't think suffering's a bad thing. It's kind of that Job business again.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's just kind of a bitching in the ultimate sense. I mean, we hold space for a lot of bitching, and that's a very good thing. So I don't mean
Mm-hmm.
that pejoratively,
Right.
but rather, the most I can kind of muster in terms of feeling righteous about how suffering shouldn't be happening isn't that it's a bad thing, but just that it sucks. You know, it's like while it's happening, it's just like the most I can kind of muster in terms of like not valuing it would just be that I don't like it.
Right.
You know,
Yes.
I think every major growth spurt that I've ever been through was kind of forced upon me, so to speak.
Oh, absolutely.
I think that it's the grit, the sand in an oyster that makes a pearl.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm curious because so I definitely struggle in the self-worth department. And, everything that you're saying around this, I know that I understand it cognitively and believe it. And it's such a struggle for me to truly really embrace that part of myself.
Yeah.
It's so much easier for me to look at somebody else and be like, oh, yeah, your suffering made you a kick-ass person and blah, blah. So I guess I'm just curious your thoughts on that. Like, from someone who was, crying in their room as a teenage boy, where are you now with self-acceptance, self-worth?
Yeah, I mean, Well, there was a paradox, I guess, in all of that, which that I felt like inferior on the one hand, but also like horribly misunderstood on the other.
Mm-hmm.
And in some sense, I had this sort of secret suspicion that I really was special
Mm-hmm.
and that other people were missing that and I wasn't made for
Mm.
this world kind of thing. And
Yeah.
I think as I've worked through a lot of the like kind of inferiority, I'm more left with the other thing.
Mm.
I would say that these days, and some of this is just like straight up male privilege. I mean, I tend to think that everybody wants to hear what I have to say.
Hmm.
And so if I'm in a room, I enjoy hearing myself speak, and I assume other people do too. Uh, and I did have an experience about 7 years ago where I really started to kind of turn the corner with feeling like a really good looking person too.
Hmm.
You know, I was in graduate school and I was just a wreck in graduate school. I did just terrible job networking there. But, I'd turned 30 and I'd been in this like long-term relationship and, she wanted to have kids and I wanted to go back to graduate school and, we ended up splitting up over it, kind of some money stuff, I suppose. That's always more complicated than that. I'm
Mm-hmm.
oversimplifying it, but all of a sudden, basically, I was a single freshman waiting tables again and turned 30 and I just freaked out and
Hmm.
started really pretending like I was still in my mid 20s in terms of partying hard and stuff. And
Hmm.
I started dating this girl who I thought was really beautiful. She was younger and I was like living with her in her like really crappy apartment with like a bunch of people but I had this really interesting experience where I was meditating and I had this fantasy of people seeing me with this beautiful person and looking at me and feeling, when I felt into it, it wasn't like I wanted people to be proud of me
Mm-hmm.
or happy for me. I wanted people to feel envy
Ha.
and really like just look at me with a beautiful person and I really got how like as a male historically I've known my beauty through like kind of vicariously glomming onto the beauty of women
Hmm.
and then how that sort of created this real collusion in me with the standard images of beauty that I think are quite disgusting in a lot of ways and just the kind of
Mm-hmm.
how much they ravage humans.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, I was working through it and I had this interesting experience of all of a sudden feeling like this like body posture that was crumpled up and I felt hot and sweaty and really repulsive and there was kind of like internalization of anti-Semitism in that as well where I felt this
Hmm.
like this repulsive Jew clinging to a beautiful person and
Hmm.
I felt like a little golem like
Hmm.
clinging to my precious.
Wow.
And it was the most palpable experience I've ever felt of just directly feeling kind of my own disconnection from how beautiful I am and how
Hmm.
sexy I am. And it was a real turning point for me to just kind of hang out with that and then just kind of, I don't know, kind of like the habituating. I mean, just going into the core of something over and over again and just
Mm-hmm.
feeling how repulsed I am by myself really freed up a whole lot. It's like in not avoiding that experience, it became less of a wound around just feeling
Yeah.
how much I love my, you know, shitty body. Just, I really like it. I mean, I've fallen in love with my hair patterns and my hair. I got a hairy chest, and I used to wish my jaw was a little bigger, and I like it now. And
Hmm.
if anybody disagrees, fuck them hard, and not even in a reactive way. It's just like it's cool. You work your side of the road, I'll work mine.
Right.
Um, I just don't feel like I need others to know myself as beautiful. I think it's such a fucking miracle that we get to have these bodies for a little
Mm-hmm.
while and then they
Right.
fall apart
Right.
and that they house like these psyches that like work through some shit. I just think it's,
Mm-hmm.
you know, your body is a temple of the Holy Ghost. I mean, for serious.
Yeah, and it's just so interesting the way you describe kind of going into the wound, because that's something in one of my last interviews with this woman, Sarah Beek. She wrote a book called Revelations, and it's pretty intense, and she talks about the experience of going inside the wound. And I guess I'm also always thinking of anybody else who might be listening who could be like, what the fuck? That's impossible. I'm not doing that. And so I guess I just want to share with people that there needs to be some sort of like base level of okayness to then be able to go inside the wound, right? Because if you have recently experienced trauma or have unresolved trauma or things like that, going inside the wound, not recommended, especially not alone. But I kind of feel like it's like next level healing kind of shit.
Yeah. I think of all therapeutic work as basically exposure. We're going there. I think it's possible to just not be that bothered by rejection. You know, I mean, it's where I think a lot of the kind of self-esteem therapies go awry, is the affirmations fall really flat, you know?
And self-esteem is about comparison. And you were just talking about being able to remove that level of comparison and just recognizing your shitty body for what it is.
Yeah. Well, and like the reframes that like a lot of like CBT stuff can be so cheap, you know, the ones that they go for. It's like, you don't know that people are judging you. That's mind reading or something.
Like,
and
no, everyone is judging.
Yeah.
Because that's what we do.
Within the first 2 seconds of seeing everybody, we've already implicitly Tinder swiped them. I mean, we know.
Right.
You know,
CBT is dumb. I've said it a million times.
Actually, I completely disagree.
I can't get on board with the idea of changing the way I think doesn't change the way I feel. It's I need to change the way I relate to the thought. That changes the way I feel. That's my thought on CBT.
I just don't see a difference in the two things you said. What I do completely agree is that there's nothing worse than really like lamely, stupidly done CBT. It's like the worst.
And maybe that's all I've ever seen.
When it's done with like sophistication and beauty, I think it's just an immaculate therapy.
Well, then I would need to see that sometime.
Just take my word for it.
Okay. I will.
Done.
Next. I believe you. So we're coming up on the end of
that. Was an hour.
Almost, yeah. Do you believe it? You're just busy listening to yourself talk.
Yeah.
Enjoying it, right?
Fun when I hear myself speak.
I know. I do too. I was just going to say, is there anything else that you'd like to hear yourself say before we end today?
Nah.
Good. Mic drop.
Said it all. Hope you liked it.
Oh my God. Oh, I loved it. We'll see. Yeah, we'll see what listeners think, but I loved it. I think you're fascinating.
Well, thank you.
Like I said before, I think you're one of the biggest freaks I've ever met, and I love that about you.
Well, you know, I will say this. I feel like people don't take as kindly to bragging as they should. Like I think bragging is, I mean, why wouldn't people brag and just like say what's amazing about themselves? I mean, we're so stingy about that.
I know.
And it's just absurd. I mean,
socialization.
I think I'm awesome, and I think you're awesome, and that's just like, I mean this. I'm not just saying it rhetorically.
Yeah.
I actually don't understand why we're so sheepish about that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I know it was certainly... Humility was required because that was what God said to do. And then this idea that being humble is essentially never talking about your positive attributes or just always being grateful for them. And I wonder if that too is a gender thing as well. I mean, more so for women than for men, because I talk about it with other female practice owners all the time, just about how together, when we're in a room together, we'll let each other brag and say whatever the fuck we want, but we wouldn't necessarily say that out in the world.
Yeah.
Because what would it look like? Gasp.
Well, I think you're awesome, and I think you should just be way too big for your britches.
Wow, that makes me scared. That could be a whole nother podcast on how much that scares me.
Yeah. That's interesting.
Well, on that note, this has been fun.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed it. I can't believe that was an hour. That's crazy.
I know.
Seriously, it feels like 20 minutes.
I know, right? Well, we'll just have to have you on again another time.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Thank you,
All
Michael.
right, Sarah. You be well.
You too. Thanks so much to Michael Lassoff for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. And as always, thanks to Andrea Klunder and Edwin Ruiz at the Creative Imposter Studios for editing, to Liam O'Donnell for the album art photo, and Ben Mueller for our theme music. For more information on Michael Lassoff, you can visit my website at www.headhearttherapy.com/podcast. You can also find Conversations with the Wounded Healer on Facebook and Twitter, and don't forget to follow us on Spotify or subscribe on iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher. Thanks so much for tuning in. Bye-bye.